Hello, everybody. We are back on broadcast. Happy New Year. This year we'll be looking at Multisite Church, and we're back today. I'm going to have a look at another area of Multisite, which is preaching. And I found that when people who haven't experienced Multisite think about it, preaching is one of the first things that comes to mind. It's an obviously visible thing, however you decide to go at it. Some churches do video preaching, or others will have the same sermon in every site, preached by either the same preacher going round, or maybe a different preacher but delivering the same talk or the same theme, or others still will have a totally different sermon in every site. It depends a little bit on your model of multi-site, but it's an important question to think about if you're considering multi-site and think it might be a way to go for you. So we've invited a couple of guests. We've got Liam Thatcher from Christchurch, London, and Colin Barron from Christchurch, Manchester. So two Christchurches on today. And we're going to talk about preaching and multi-site. The way we will do it is a question and answer format. So I've got a few questions that I'm going to put to Liam and to Colin over the course of the next hour. Also, if you have any questions, either questions that you've already got in your mind about preaching and multi-site coming into this, or questions that are sparked off by things that the guests say, then you can ask them. Feel free to just open up the Q&A or the chat applications here on Zoom. Put your questions in and I'll make sure they get asked to the guests. But let's start by just introducing who we've got on. So my name's Tom. I'm your host this evening, this afternoon even. Colin, you've been on before. Why don't you just take a minute or two and just tell us who you are, what you're doing, and how Christchurch, Manchester got into multi-site.
Okay, so my name's Colin. I came to Manchester over 25 years ago as a church planter, and kind of decided that I wanted to do multiple church plants. So I actually stumbled into multi-site a little bit by starting a number of sites that we linked together and had no terminology for, but we did 8. They then went into separate churches, which was always our plan. And then, having 2 years away, I came back again to Manchester and started Christchurch, Manchester, with a lot more knowledge and also a bit of a better idea of and terminology, because far more churches were doing multi-site, and we're now 5 sites in Manchester.
Great. And Liam, just tell us a bit about yourself, about what you do, and about Christchurch, London's journey to multi-site.
Great. Yep. So my name's Liam, and I am at Christchurch, London. I've lived here for 10 years now and been part of the team here for most of that time. And my main role is that I'm our teaching pastor, so I oversee all our preaching, do a lot of it myself, and then I oversee various other areas, our marriage ministry, prayer teams, that sort of thing. And our journey to multi-site was, our church has just turned 15 years old. I joined when we were 5, and up to about 4 years ago, we met in one location, 2 services in one location, and we were thinking of starting another service in the south of London, but God sort of surprised us by, we felt, leading us to actually launch from 2 services in one location to 4 in 4 different locations, all in one day. So we did that quite quickly. And I think in certain areas we were well thought through, other areas we've had to backfill. And then quickly we added in a 5th service, now a 6th one, and we have a 7th one coming down the track, hopefully by the end of this year. So there's been quite a lot of quick adaptation to it. And it's been great fun.
Great. So going from where you were to the new way of doing it, that would have posed a question about preaching. When it was just 2 meetings in the same building, was that 2 identical services? So the same talk, the same songs, the same thing repeated, or were they different at all?
Yeah, by and large, it was the same thing repeated. The only differences would be that we would have kids work in the first service, but that all happened outside the auditorium anyway. So the bulk of the service was the same. And there may be a bit of adaptation with worship with different songs, according to wherever God led. But by and large, they were repeat services. Yeah.
Yeah. So then going from that to being in 4 different buildings, I presume that meant that lots of the things would need to then be worked out locally. And I presume as well that as a church team, there were things that you wanted to see consistent across the board. Tell us how you factored preaching into that conversation, what some of the questions you started asking were, where you landed with it, and maybe what some of the underpinning philosophy of ministry and of Multisite that led you the way you've gone.
Yeah, great questions. Yeah, so I guess as everyone does when they think about going multi-site, you think about what are all the things that should unify us as however many services you are. What do we want to keep together and central, and what do we want to have local expressions of? And I think when we started, we felt like initially we wanted to keep things relatively similar, knowing that essentially the people we had were just going to be the base of these new services. It wasn't like day one we were immediately going to have brand new people there. So we started by essentially doing very similar things in each setting, similar sorts of style to worship, but of course the service sizes were vastly different, so it would feel different in different areas. But philosophically, we wanted it basically to feel quite similar, with a view to then contextualizing over time. And preaching, we felt like it was something that we wanted to, we feel, I mean, obviously it's always arrogant to say this when you're the teaching pastor, but we felt like preaching was one of our strengths. And that was often what we were hearing back from people. And so we felt like we wanted to maintain the quality and consistency of our preaching and have that as one of the key vehicles for unifying and preaching a unifying message across all our services. So of course you quite early on have the conversation about video and that sort of thing. And we felt initially in the early days that actually relationship was so important to us that we wanted to keep everything live. And we had to sort of build our philosophy around that. And actually the way it worked was we staggered our services, our 4 services, so that it was physically possible to get round all 4 in a day. And partly that was just where it fell anyway, naturally, 2 morning, 2 afternoon. But also there was a slight sort of tweaking to make sure that it was possible. And so from the very beginning, when I preached, I did 4 in one day and scooted between them. Yeah.
Great.
So now you're not 4, you're 5, and then 6
yeah.
and 7. You must have a fast motorbike.
Well, yes, sadly not fast enough, but yeah, well, so it's had to adapt now over time. And so we've still kept live, which is not to say we would never use video, it's just we haven't so far. And I think if we did, we'd want to in maybe quite a limited or specific way. But now generally so I do probably slightly more preaching than most others, and I don't lead a service, so I'm a bit more flexible. So typically when I preach now, I do 3 on the first week, 2 on the second week, 1 on the third week. And I have up to now preached 1 sermon a month, which means 3 weeks on, 1 week off. That's not necessarily very sustainable, so we'll reduce that over the coming year or so. But that's roughly the sort of model I have now. Yeah.
Colin, do you want to chip in a bit and share how it's approached in Manchester, a little bit different from the way CCL go at it? Yeah, do you want to talk about
that? Yeah. Some of it is based a little bit on my conversion. I was converted in a Methodist church, and at 16, never been to church really much before that. But effectively, I then was a local preacher at 18, well trained by the system they had. And so that circuit system, which I eventually, when they wanted me to be a minister, I didn't really want to be a circuit minister because I could see a lot of the challenges of that. I did see the fact that it was a great vehicle for raising up young people like myself and getting them to preach. So I think that's always been part of who I am. Unlike Liam, I'm not the teaching pastor. I can preach pretty well, but leadership and strategy is probably my bigger gift, and training people. So that bore into what we're doing. I think the second thing that bore into what we're doing is because we were a multi-planting site. When I first came to Manchester, it was to start sites. Effectively, our goal was to train preachers and elders and leaders for each one. So in a sense, that kind of meant that that became our philosophy, second time in, I think we wanted to be much more of a multi-site in terms of it was consistent, it was one church in multiple locations, and we would stay together for quite a while. And that obviously then raised the question about the preaching, the way we were doing it, which was raising lots of preachers up. And I felt actually that we could sustain doing it that way and still be unified. In fact, a question I often get asked is, how does unity work? Because effectively what we have is, in every one of our sites now, they have their own preaching series, and we train, I think, 40 preachers now to preach in those sites. A very, very different model to, I would say, a lot of multi-sites.
Yeah.
Well, as you've just said, a question that often gets asked is about unity. How would you answer that then? If the message is so different in every site, how do you guard against that impeding unity, or have you found it not to be a problem, or what would you say?
Well, let me be ultra controversial. I'm not sure it is a big unity thing. I think it's more felt in the leadership team than in the congregation. That's a personal opinion, okay? And of course, I would say that, but I've never really felt it's been the strongest unifier, and it may reflect on who I am as well, in terms that that I don't see myself as a big platform preacher, teacher. So, but yeah, so effectively we work on unity on a load of other things like prayer meetings together, baptisms together, missions together, working with the poor, serving the poor, raising money. So effectively, we've kind of used a different lever, if I could use that, or different levers to preach to the preaching as to address the unity thing.
Yeah. So Colin was talking about preaching being local on different sites. Liam, you were talking about how you yourself get around to preach at the different sites of Christchurch, London. Would that be true for all of the preaching that happens? When it's people who aren't you that are preaching, do they also go around, or do you have any local preaching? How does that work?
Yeah. It's it's a very good question, and this kind of actually comes back to what Colin said there about unity and whether preaching is really something that unifies the church or not. For me, I think it can be, but I think a lot of people overplay or overstate the role that preaching has in leadership, as if I think in many churches it maybe used to be the case, maybe still is, where the primary preacher is the primary leader and that's the way he exerts his leadership. And I don't think that's necessarily the way it is in our model. So I think we also have had to find other ways of creating unity outside of the preaching, which does give you flexibility to have people preaching different sermons in different locations. But we do think there are certain things about preaching that do unify us, as long as you're intentional about it. So where we've adapted it to now is that because we quite quickly went into a multi-site model, we had a number of people who were kind of good core preachers, and then a few people who'd had a go and were doing a really great job in their local setting, but we didn't have enough to suddenly staff everyone and every service. So what we've had to do is almost create 3 tiers of preacher. Not that we tell people you're a 1, 2, or 3, but we kind of have our core preachers who are largely on staff, and Sunday may be a working day for them. And for those people, the general expectation is you preach all 6 services across 3 weeks. But then there are some pressures on that, which maybe I'll come back to in a second. And then we have other volunteer preachers who would preach brilliantly in their local setting, and we want to invest in them to do that. And we have probably about 22, I think, of those who we used last year. But what we lack is people who sort of fill a gap between those two, who are maybe volunteers who we would like to preach in other settings other than just their local setting, but we wouldn't send round to all 6. So we're trying to intentionally, at the moment, build that sort of middle strata of the preaching team. So volunteers who we may get to do 2 or 3 services, who carry enough of our kind of DNA, quality, etc., that we'd be happy to put them on any of our stages, but we're not going to use in the same sort of time-consuming way as me. So we do have plenty of local settings, plenty of local specific services, and one of the things that it gives me a bit of a headache, and if you see my rota, it will probably give you a headache as well, is with some of our core preachers, they may also be service leaders, and so to take them away for 2 Sundays in a row from their primary service may not be feasible, and so that immediately means you get extra gaps where you have to fill it with local preachers, or you have to find a new sort of way of using that space, and that's only going to increase, I think. So yeah,
no, that makes sense. Just to then further ask about this, and in terms of the content that is taught by both by the core preachers who do all 6, by the local volunteer preachers, who determines what is taught on? Would that all run through you and through the central team, or when it's a local preacher, would it be site leaders speaking into the topics and themes? How does that work?
Yeah, a mixture. So we have what we call our preaching forum, which is just a workshop that I convene, and that currently includes our service leaders, who are also primary preachers, then a couple of others who are key core preachers but are not leading services, and our process is generally, what do we think God is wanting to say to us as a whole church right now, and we talk about that, and we come up with the theme together. I might then go away and come up with a plan that's sort of like, here are the 6 or 7 topics we could cover on that, and then given that preaching forum often covers a lot of the preaching, we then know what each of us is going to preach on. But then if we've identified we're going to have spaces for local preachers here and here, sometimes I'll make suggestions to those preachers, or sometimes I'll talk in conversation with them and I'll draw out what they may want to preach on. And I think with so when we're doing a thematic series like we are at the moment, where the topics may not be linked by the same book or something like that, I think some of our preachers find it quite difficult if you throw it to them and say, you can preach on anything within this broad theme. So sometimes I had to be quite direct and say, I'd like you to preach on this title, this passage, and here are rough sort of points. But then there are plenty of others who I just know they're great, and I'll sort of just throw the theme to them and see what they come up with. But at different times of year, over the summer particularly, we have more opportunities for local preachers, and we often find that because of the weirdness of our staggering system, it actually makes it quite difficult to work through a book in the exact order. So we often find that that's pushed us towards a slightly more thematic approach when it's the core preachers preaching, and then maybe over the summer that's more opportunities to work through a book chapter by chapter in the correct order, and those are often the talks that we give to local preachers.
Colin, do you want to speak a bit about how this works at CCM and where the decisions are made for what is taught on, how much impact or input you want to have into that, and who makes what decisions?
Yeah. So I think we kind of, having said that we do everything as local, we do have some big events and some big opportunities that we make it more consistent. So twice a year we have a big give offering, for instance. So effectively, we would give away to the poor in November. We'd do mission in May. So we try and make sure that the preaching before those events are similar all the way across the sites. They may use different passages, but it's the same theme. Obviously, Christmas is a bit like that. We also have kind of series that we'll do. So we kind of are very strong on some of the cultures that we're trying to develop in the church, of being generous, being wholehearted, forward-looking, giving people second chances. And so we would also say to some of our sites, actually, every now and then it would be good to do those cultures. In fact, one of our sites is they're just embarking on them now, so they'll have a series. So there are kind of series. There's new people, and we're growing all the time. So we don't take for granted that everybody understands what they're coming into. So we have a number of those kind of series that actually help the local, and they will then take those. So that in a sense they're some of the things that are become consistent. Our big thing is to try and get the standard up. So we do a lot of training, a lot of. I know you personally, Tom, listen to a lot of the sermons that are preached. All the site leaders are trained now to actually assess the preachers, and we have a preaching course that people go on that effectively gives them these are what we're looking for, and that's in a sense all the assessment, all the feedback is given against that. I think the other thing we're finding is as more people get married, as we're getting more sites, more people are actually having to do one-off preachers. So it's, so they'll get asked, "Can you preach at my wedding?" There's numbers of carol services and stuff. So we're actually now realising we're having to teach a lot more on how do you actually do a one-off talk to non-Christchurch Manchester people and actually do well. So yeah, I don't know if that answers part of the question, Tom.
It is, yeah. Let's just dig a bit more into this idea of training and development. I think one of the things that is quite a common perception of Multisite that I don't think is true in either of your cases is that it limits the opportunities to preach to one or two particularly gifted people. And often it's a video model that people have in mind when they say that. But hearing you both talk, Colin, you've been talking about sort of training 40. Liam, you were mentioning 22 volunteers plus the staff core team. There seems to be in both instances a lot of people getting an opportunity to preach, which does raise the questions: how do you make sure that they're good, and or do you make sure that they're good? But what's the interplay between wanting to be empowering, wanting to make it so that people on the ground can step out in their gifts in the way they may well be able to in a smaller local church without the kind of big multi-site there, but also they're representing your church brand, so to speak. They might be going up on the web, and a lot of people might be listening in and getting a taste of your church based on this. There's an interplay there. How do you work that through? What do you do to empower but train and develop people? And how do you answer some of those questions? Liam, do you want to chip into that first, and then Colin?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I think you're right. I think a common perception of multi-site is that it, and it can be true, is it gets built around one particular preaching gift, which gets replicated everywhere, often by video, but not exclusively. And I think we have recognized that there are certain voices within our community who we want everyone to hear, but there are also certain, we value locality and we value different voices, and we don't want to get locked into a particular style, because variety is important and training others is important. So I think because we went to multi-site quite quickly, we were not as intentional at the front end of creating a course, for example, like you guys have. So we never had a sort of one place where we gathered everyone together. So a lot of our coaching has been me one-on-one with individuals, which has been great up to now and is now becoming quite limiting. So now where I want to take it is towards whether it is a course or just some clearer articulation of our values. I don't quite know. So we have all our values spelt out. We have guidelines for how to preach in a way that sort of is us. We then have a feedback form which I use with people who it sort of allows them to know what the criteria is, so they can self-reflect on it, and then I can give some feedback. And at the moment, I give feedback on every talk, whether I've heard it live or I listen to it. But as well as that, we also have the freedom for the service leaders to speak into the people who've spoken in their particular setting. So at the moment, it's quite relational rather than course-based. I think I'd like us to move to a hybrid model of the two. So I don't have to listen to a zillion messages on Philippians every summer or whatever it happens to be. So, yeah.
Yes. Colin, do you want to add anything? I know you talked a little bit about some of the mechanisms and courses, but even like philosophically about people being empowered and able to have a go. And do you want to just speak into that a little bit?
Yeah. I was fascinated with what you said, Liam, that some of the more volunteer preachers sometimes find it difficult on some of the concepts to do it. I've noticed that actually one of the challenges of doing a centralised topic and trying to, which some multi-sites do, so they'll actually have local preachers, but they'll centralise the kind of decision making on it. I will preach through Hebrews, and so everybody's on the same chapter, but different preachers. What I noticed is there's a number of people that doesn't work for, and especially people who have been, have less time or don't do it very often. And so one of the things I've felt is that they need to be given as much scope as possible to actually do well, which means not putting them into a box. And so that's one of the reasons we pushed it out local a bit more, is to actually make it more accessible, not only to the congregation, but to the availability of the preachers there. So that's, I think, is important for me. I think also actually making it a sermon 30 minutes now, not 45, is really helpful. And actually, people who had to do multiple services in the same building had to tighten their preaching down. And when I learned years ago, before I came into the kind of new church movement, you had a 20-minute, half-hour time slot to go for. Actually, I think that's been very helpful as well, because actually it's easier for people to do well in half an hour. Once they get to 40 minutes, just 45 minutes, it's just difficult. So that, for me, is quite an important bit, actually. So we kind of have time restraints, not because we need it, but actually because we do. I think it's a very helpful discipline, especially as you bring in new preachers. I think the other thing is, for us, I do recognise that actually we do need a higher level teaching as well. And so we've started a School of Theology, which is deliberately designed it's free. It's some of the best teachers. We have you, Liam, on it. So
some of the best teachers and me.
No, you are one of the best. But no, so we effectively see that actually if we had put very good teaching on as well, basically our church, we've got the best of both worlds. It's a free access, Saturday morning, once a month, you get the whole Bible in 2 years, and it's just a superb thing. And basically on the Sunday, you're going to get people doing good, but it gives us a little bit more flexibility, that we're doing a very good teaching for the whole church, but slightly differently, it's not all happened on the Sunday morning.
I think that's a good example there with the School of Theology of something that we've been able to do because of Multisite, in a way that had we planted 5 or 6 separate congregations that didn't work together as a Multisite, it would have been a lot more difficult. Do you want to just talk about how Multisite can help, how the strength of being together can help some of these kind of bigger pieces that can serve the whole?
For me,
yeah. Just elaborate that, and then.
No, I mean, I think the average sized church, or the majority of churches in the UK are about 90 people, 80, 90 people. The percentage that are into the multi-hundreds are not many, and then it gets less and less. And so what happens, I think Multisite gives you the ability to grow, actually. I mean, it's not a prerequisite for growth, and also everybody who does Multisite doesn't mean it will grow, but it has for for us, which means we've got, multi-hundreds of people now. And I think by having something that's cohesive together, you've just got the resource to put something on, and you've got the opportunity for ministry. So that's been a real blessing for us. And I think we could do things that we wouldn't be able to do as a single church, which would be smaller than what we are now.
I mean, I'm sure your experience is a little bit different, Liam, coming at Multisite from already having been at a pretty large church in one location to then going to multiple. How have you found it working in terms of offering teaching, offering training, and offering different things across the church? How has that changed as you've changed the structure of the church?
Yeah, our experience is very, very different to yours. And actually, I love coming up and being at School of Theology and getting to teach at CCM. And I'm sort of jealous every time I come and I see you pack out your building for School of Theology of people from your church and from other churches as well. And if I try and do something on a Saturday, just no one comes. If anyone tries to do something on a Saturday, not just me, to be clear. And we've done that. And we used to, when we had two services in the same building, it meant that actually between them, I could do a theology seminar and over 7 weeks work through Revelation or whatever, and people would come in between the services, and that was great. What we found is having gone from that to suddenly local, people are like, oh, I love local. And then what they love is hyper local. It's got to be not only in their borough, it's got to be really close to them. So then the idea of traveling across London, which may take an hour and a quarter or something, just is a no for people. And also, as we've had more and more families and that sort of thing, we've just found Saturdays don't work. So there are no geographically obvious locations to gather people together, or within our general week, there aren't many obvious times to gather people together. So I think actually we've struggled to do centralized training, be that theology training or preaching training. So a lot of my coaching actually with, say, take the prayer teams, for example, another area I coach, a lot of that is having to go and coach the individual teams in their individual settings, which is great on the one hand, because it means I'm able to contextualize for the way that prayer should work best in a large setting compared to a student setting, whatever it happens to be. So for contextualizing your teaching, it's great. But I am slightly jealous of those opportunities you have where people are just hungry and eager to come together on a Saturday for something centralized. I don't feel like we've got that. I don't know how we crack that.
Okay. Well, let's talk a little bit about a question of capacity, because I think that flows a little bit out of your answer. If you're going to all these places and delivering the same training multiple times, that's asking more of you. And there's only a certain amount of time, energy, availability that you'd be able to give as a central person. I think the multi-site question can challenge what can be done whichever way you go at it. And it seems like perhaps your model of preaching in London, there'd be a capacity challenge on the individuals who are going around doing the same sermon in 6 different locations over 3 weeks. In Manchester, the capacity challenge is if we've got 6 different sermons being preached by different people every single week, that is a big ask, and it could put again a bit of a challenge locally, constantly raising up new people to fill rotas. How have you found these challenges? What ideas or strategies have you come up with to help with them a bit? Liam, do you want to go first, and then?
Yeah. And you're absolutely right, and I think there are strengths and weaknesses of both. And for me, actually, I find that my model at the moment, I may be preaching most weeks, but I'm not preaching a new sermon most weeks. So actually, I think that the model we have is highly efficient on a preacher's time. Whereas if I were in your context, I might imagine that I might be speaking, and it's not about the numbers. So hear me right here. I don't mind preaching to 30 people, and that's the only number of people who ever hear my sermon. That's fine. But actually, if I know that I can preach the same sermon 6 times over 3 weeks to 600 people, rather than having to preach every other week to a smaller number of people, I think that's a better use of my time. It means I'm able to keep a high level of quality. So I may speak 12 sermons to my church over a year, or 10 sermons over a year, but that will be to my whole church, and it means that every Sunday I'm doing something. That works for me because I'm not a service leader, but if you're also leading a service, that's just not so possible. So at the moment I take some of the weight so that the service leaders preach less frequently on the circuit, and I should say that the local service leaders often also have opportunities where they just speak directly to their own service. So there may be certain weeks where you do have 6 different services, or 6 different sermons rather, and they're all done deliberately focused on their local setting. So I actually think what we do is a good use of resource, although, as I've said, it's a high bar to set for volunteers. So so we've struggled to get people who can do like 3 services in a day, or whatever it happens to be.
Yeah, Colin, any thoughts on that? I know sometimes you'll be preaching different things in different sites, and it means preparing a lot of talks. Like, how do you respond or feel about those comments?
Yeah, no, it is a challenge. When I was on the New Frontiers international team, travelling a lot, I actually found, and I guess that actually drove a little bit into our model as well, that I couldn't prepare new talks. And one of the things about a travelling ministry is you can do the same talk numbers of times, whereas you can't on a local. So actually, I cut down on my preaching locally, which gave opportunities for a lot of others. I'm not on the team. I'm much more Manchester based now, so I'm actually finding the challenge of preparing new talks actually I enjoy. So I'm actually giving myself far more, but it is a bit of a law of diminishing returns. You spend a lot of time preparing for a small group. I think that is correct. I mean, we're not quite as like that in terms that we will use our talks in different congregations, because they do cover similar themes over a period of time. So, over a 2-year period, 3-year period, I probably, on the culture talks, for instance, I'll probably do that in much every congregation. So there's numbers of talks actually, and even, one congregation might do Philippians, and then another one might do it 2 years down the line, and they know you're prepared on that one. So we do try and help where possible to maximise, especially the main preachers, to actually be a little bit more efficient. But it is one of the downsides, and I in sense it's not brilliantly cost effective, especially if you're using staff people, and so that's that is a factor. But I think it's weighed against the opportunity of a lot of other people being able to do it. So there's always a kind of cost and benefit and a downside to take.
It also, I've noticed it works quite well as a last resort in case of emergency. I've known times, quite a few, where I'll get a call on a Saturday from a site leader saying, like, person X was due to preach and this crisis has come up in their life. Over the last year, you've preached 20 sermons that my site hasn't heard. Would you come and bring one? Which is just a nice fallback to have as well. If you're watching this and you've got questions, feel free to ask them. We've still got a good amount of time to discuss, so just type them in. One thing I want to open up, which I know neither of you do, but I'd like to hear your thoughts on, because for many people looking at Multisite, at least the question of should we use video will be one that they're asking. Why don't you use it, and what would be some of the strengths and weaknesses of going down that route, do you think? Liam, do you want to share your thoughts on it?
Yeah, sure. So we don't use it for a number of reasons. Partly, technologically, it's quite tricky to pull off, particularly if you want. I mean, there are different models of using video, even whether it's live streaming, and that's more difficult if you've got multiple services happening at the same time. So technologically, it is a challenge. which is one factor, but also we just felt like actually relationship was so important. So because we went from a place where everyone knew the leaders to suddenly scattered in multiple places, we still wanted leaders to be able to see and hear from me and our other key preachers, and actually connect with us as well, not just via a screen. So we think that relationship is really important. And for me, I think there's always a balance between quality, which you can get if I'm preaching to a video once and I know I can, or a few times, and then I pick the best version of that goes out. Like, you can measure quality really well, but also flexibility is really important. And at least for me, I think there's something about video which, as a preacher, I feel like I'm not only just conveying a good message, I feel like I'm bringing something of a gift from God that is there by my presence as well. So, little example, I preached last Sunday at the fourth and fifth time I'd done this particular sermon, and the fifth time in the evening, I suddenly felt in the moment, I need to scrap the final 10 minutes of this and do something like off the cuff, which included bringing some words of knowledge, which were very specific for people in that service. And I landed it in a totally different way. Now, if we had a video, of course, the host could have done that and landed the talk in a particular way. But as a preacher, I felt like I needed to do something different in a moment that video wouldn't have allowed me to do. And I don't think, therefore, that I'm saying video is never possible or video quenches the spirit or anything like that at all. There are ways around it. And actually, I could preach, if I preach just the same message, identical every time, without ever stopping and saying, what does the Spirit want to say to this service that might be different to the other? I might as well do it by video, because if it's just a carbon copy, that's no better. But for me as a preacher now, I approach this thinking, how can I have a high quality message? How can I, as an individual, bring something here as well? Whether that's a word of knowledge or something I've got in prayer for this service, or just being around at the service so people can ask me questions about what I've said, that sort of thing. I feel like those relationship things are really important. That said, there are some reasons why we might consider using video. So, for example, if we get a guest speaker, we can't tour them around all our services. And if it's a big name guest speaker, then actually someone may rather have that person on video at their service the next week than me or a local preacher. So I think there are some cases where we would consider using video. And also, as I said, it's difficult for our service leaders to be away from their service too frequently. So say our senior leader was preaching on something that's a really core message that we need everyone to hear, but it's not possible to get around all the services. I would consider, and we probably will trial this fairly soon, recording that and playing that as a one-off. But to my mind, I think we will always have video as the minority element of our preaching rather than the majority, because I think relationship and presence are so important.
Great. Colin, do you want to share some of your thoughts on this as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think it works for a certain type of gift, and it works if you've got your own buildings as well. That helps. Yeah. I think when you're renting space, it's much more harder because just the tech. Also, there's the money side of it is to make it good. So people would think that I'm not very for it, but I am in the right location with the right people. You know, I think it definitely works, and I've been involved in help churches that do video in a very good way. So I think, you know, we're just looking at, you know, are we a bit more consistent even with, you know, when we've got announcements and things. I think I think for us, we're smaller congregations, you know, 30 to 70 people, all in rented space. So I think it's just impossible to make it work. But I say I can see the value in it, and I know numbers of churches that have gone video have tended to now do a bit of a hybrid.
Yeah.
So I think, like anything, I think, you know, the majority will probably end up with something that has a bit of both in the thing. I think, you know, I think in America, some of the very larger churches, you know, it's a bit more consistent there. I think in the UK, I think it's less able to do that for numbers of reasons. Some of them are. Even the way people are wired. I mean, it was interesting, the conversation we had before about alpha. And, you know, some people want alpha on a video. Some people want live. And funnily enough for us, we actually have quite a good take-up for actually on the screen. But again, it's just the way I think congregations are wired and the type of settings that you're in.
Yes, so that's a really interesting comment. So yeah, we were talking before we came on air about alpha and how we're doing it here at the moment, and we've just made a switch from having done live talks for years to using the videos to back to live talks again. And what we've found is that often in a place like London, people are very cynical, but also have access to so much streaming content anyway. Actually, a lot of people feel very turned off by anything that feels too corporate, too polished, too, I guess, slick. And so I think some people really don't like anything that feels like there's a machine behind this. And instead soften to something that feels live and present. So that's, I mean, again, with Alpha, I think the Alpha videos are brilliant, and we use them in small settings in people's homes. If we were doing it in a coffee shop, we might use it, that sort of thing. So we do a hybrid of those two. But I think that's a great example of how some people react very badly to video and some people don't. And so I think probably looking at our 6 services currently, there are some that I imagine, because of their size, because of the makeup of the crowd, they may prefer video, and that might work well. But the majority of them I don't think are like that. So thinking what are the needs of each service and how's that going to appeal to or put people off means that if we did adopt video, I think it will be limited in certain places.
Yeah, I think as we've alluded to a few times, by not using video, you're both in a situation where you're having people preach and you're not in the room, and you're trying to work with them and develop them and help them grow in that gifting. Could you just talk us through what that process looks like? And I presume you'd listen to a recording of it, or someone on your team would listen to a recording. And then how do you work with the people who are preaching when you're not there to make sure that you've got really good preaching happening?
Yeah.
Liam, do you want to?
Yeah, sure. So I think being clear with people about criteria up front is really important, and that's something we hadn't always done a great job of in the past. So making it really clear what people should be aiming for is helpful. And then what I tend to do with people is I give them the initial brief, or we talk about the initial idea behind the series. If they've never preached before, we'll talk through the kind of guidelines. I will have a number of conversations with them, again, depending on the level of their proficiency. And I always look through a script before the sermon currently. And on some occasions, if I've identified that the person maybe is brilliant with their content but lacking the presentational skills, then I will get them to do a bit to me live or something like that. And then I always, well, ideally, I try and be at as many as possible so that I can not only hear the content, but see and feel what it's like, how it comes across in the room. If I can't be there, then I will listen to the podcast and I'll get feedback from their service leader who actually was there. And of course, the service leaders have freedom to give feedback to the person as well. But then that's partly why, for me, self-reflection is as important as my feedback. So getting the person to reflect on, how did I feel about the use of my body, or how tense I felt, or how did I feel about the emotional temperature of the room, or that sort of thing, opens up really good conversations. And we always make an action plan at the end of any sermon. What's the area that I want to grow in next time? And then we think, how can we be intentional about that? And it may be months before they get another chance to preach, but then we'll think, well, what are the other ways we can grow that in between? So there's not a clear sort of track that you must preach and or you must do notices, host a service, and then you get to preach, or something like that. But many of our preachers do also host services and do notices. So sometimes I will say to someone, okay, something you really struggled with was eye contact. Next time you're giving a notice, let's set you a goal and use that as a learning opportunity. in between the sermons. So it's not all on the sermon, it's on other tasks as well.
Yeah, great. Colin, do you want to talk a bit about at CCM then, someone who preaches, maybe you or others from the core team out in the room? How does that person get developed? What
Yeah, no, I would pick up a little bit what Liam said as well about actually using other means like the notices. I think teaching people to communicate is often a missing link in a lot of preacher training. So, you know, I've noticed around the country when I've gone to churches and they have preaching courses, effectively it's a kind of theology course, not a communication course. Mm-hmm. So, you know, how to do good hermeneutic, etc. And actually, it's almost like one of the first things is to be able to communicate. And saying that to a theologian, a Bible teacher, sometimes is kind of like, oh, no. But actually, you know, if someone can't engage a congregation, they could have the best content in the world, but actually it misses. So I think actually I've often said to people, do the notices. Mm-hmm. This is how to intro a meeting. Even standing up to welcome people at the start of a meeting is a massive learning thing, because so many preachers stutter and stumble over their first few words. Yeah, they want to engage the congregation and actually ad lib. Yeah, and and I think I was very bad at that. So I personally have had to have people like you, Tom, and others help me be a much more kind of diligent on my intro. So just picking up that, I think that having a bigger scheme than just preacher train is really helpful. I think also helping people to get better. So, you know, for me, I want to see people improve, and I also know that not every time you do well. Yeah. And I think what I've noticed is a lot of churches will introduce someone to preach. They bomb, they don't do very well, and that's the last you see of them, effectively. And the reality is, you know, the best preachers in the world do bad sermons. I mean, you know, that's just the way it is, you know.
Speak for yourself, Colin.
Yeah, Liam, you may have done one. But no, genuinely, I think, so I'm always looking, okay, let's see if we can get some of the improvement. And then, you know, people, you know, we've got 2 or 3 great preachers in our church who are good trainers, and giving them opportunity to speak into things. I realise that a lot of people need a few voices in. They need one voice who's the kind of main voice, but actually just even picking up, you know, having some emotional intelligence. You know, how is the room feeling? Yeah, is actually again. So I know, you know, I know I can help people on that. You know, and I know that we've got other people that really do help structure, you know, how to start and, you know, get it right. So for me, we do have kind of systems, we do have courses, but I think in the end, it's actually making sure that as best possible we're getting people to improve. Yeah. And that goes for myself. I feel like I have improved quantum leap in the last 2 or 3 years. 64 years old, but I feel like I'm part of the whole learning community that we are now in Christchurch, Manchester. I'm much more self-reflective on. I know, you know, now. Okay, that wasn't good. In fact, on intros, I would ring people up now and say, I've got this sermon, I can't think of a good intro. Can you help me? And I've never done that. And I just kind of, well, I know I get hammered if I was, no, you know, I've just got to land it much better.
Yeah. Just to pick up on 2 things that you said there. One, I think the culture of a a church is so important, and that's one of the things I really I notice as an outsider coming into your church to preach once a year or so. I feel like you've cultivated a pioneering second chance culture where people know I'm trusted, I'm loved. This is not an audition to get another go. Like there's this acceptance that makes people sort of feel able to be vulnerable, able to take risks, and I think that's so important. And also a culture of learning is really important. And I think that within that as well, a lot of people, when they start to think about how do I coach preachers, what's really in their mind is how do I coach preachers to do what I want, so that they preach in our style, whereas what I want to do is think, how can I coach preachers to be who God has made them to be within the bandwidth of what our philosophy is. So our philosophy may be from here to here, and there are certain things we'll never do because they're extremes either way. But within that, like there'll be people who are way more narrative driven, or just tons of stories, or real like work through verse by verse by verse. And if it fits within our philosophy, then I want to say, okay, how can you be different from me, rather than how can I fit you into our mold? And then sometimes within that, I have to recognize, well, I am more of a teacher / prophet than I am a sort of primary leader. Like leadership, pure leadership is not my strength. And so if that's an area that is a strength of someone else, or an area they need to grow, I might need to defer to someone else in the team and say, why don't you run that point past that person, or call that person and ask them to help you with the intro, or whatever it happens to be. And I think that kind of open-heartedness of a sort of have a go, second chance culture, and also we're all learning, and we cannot do it one, as individuals, we need each other. I think those are really important. Otherwise the coaching process becomes really restrictive and unhelpful, and it just quashes any creativity and uniqueness in individuals.
We've got just 4 more minutes left. I've just got one more question that we'll open up to wrap it up, and then we'll call stumps. The question's about how much preachers liaise with meeting hosts or worship leaders, particularly when it's the same sermon being given at different sites. Do you feed back in what kind of response has worked in some of the other meetings, or do you kind of leave it open to each one being separate? Or how do you do that? Liam, do you want to go? Actually, you probably do more taking sermons around.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So I have a plan A for every service. So I liaise with the worship leader and I say, this is the sort of song I think I would like afterwards. And I have an idea of how ministry might go. And some settings, I'm there for the ministry time. One of our services, I have to preach and then leave. And so the rest of the service carries on without me. So in that setting, I have to set up the host a bit more so that they know what to do, when I'm gone. And of course, they have complete freedom to take it wherever they and God want. But as the day goes on, it may chop and change, and I may do different things in different services, in which case sometimes that contact with the meeting leader, sometimes I can preempt how it's going to go, and I might say, I think this will be a bit different to how I did it in the South, but sometimes you don't know until the moment, in which case just having a conversation with the meeting host is really important. And I think as a preacher, there are times where I just know as soon as I'm done and I hand over the mic, that's fine. It's in the host's hands, and they're probably better able to apply it other times. And then there are some moments where I just know, no, I've got something here, and we just talk. And it might be that just during that song, I go over and I say, I think this is what I'm thinking of doing. Will this work? And usually the host will say, yep, go for it. So sometimes you can preempt it. I always have a plan A. And like you said, Colin, earlier about people not doing very well at intros and outros, I think so many preachers just think, I'll get to the end and then I'll pray a prayer and it'll be fine. I won't need to think about that until the moment. And then what comes out is the most garbled, jargon-heavy prayer you can imagine. So for me, thinking about a landing is always really important. I always know how I'm going to land it unless God says otherwise, and then I'll adapt in the moment.
Yeah. Colin, you do it a bit less, but on the times you do take sermons to different sites, do you kind of feed in what response has worked, or do you leave it more open?
I think because we do communion, we preach early in the service and then worship and communion, the majority afterwards. I think over the time I'm beginning to see communion as I ask the question: is that part of my preach, or is it part of the worship? And so sometimes I'm becoming much more, and sometimes I know it's helpful if I lead the communion, for instance, because it basically part of preaching. More and more, I'm actually looking at how to finish the sermon. I think the other thing is, by preaching early, one of the challenges is you get very focused on the preach and the kind of ministry aspect of the preach, as opposed to engaging with our Father in heaven. And so I think that one of the things that always, again, learning is when to actually know, okay, we're going to land it here, we're going to worship, and then we'll have some ministry time afterwards. Yes, and I think so. I think I'm long-winded way of saying more and more, just beginning to liaise with the host to have that. This is actually how I think it should go, and in our context, that is not just the ministry time. It's effectively how do we kind of take off from this moment with another 20-minute, half-hour worship time with communion. And I think I like the way we do it, but its downside is you can be almost application orientated and not kind of God adoring. I don't think we do. I think sometimes we don't do that very well. I think it's a big learning curve still for us, and especially when you've got multiple preachers. So the liaising is important.